Good morning, everyone. I think we'll get started. I know that more will join us as we progress. But first of all, just a huge thank you to all of you for taking the time to join us this morning. We're delighted that you're with us. Just to note, a little admin, there will be recording today. It will be available after the webinar as well in English and in Arabic for those who are unable to join us or wish to come back and revisit. So I'm going to start with an introduction, and then I will hand over to many of my colleagues in the research team. So lawyers and doctors from both Synergy and LDHR have been working together since 2013. We've been building capacity to undertake both forensic medical evaluations in relation to torture and sexual violence in Syria, but also to create holistic survivor-centered responses for the survivors of those crimes. By the middle of 2019, LDHR had conducted around 500 forensic medical evaluations of Syrian men and women, which were recorded using a standard form based on international best practice, including the Istanbul Protocol. As a result, we recognized that we'd created an important data set which captured details both of sexual violence as well as medical and psychological symptoms over time. Many of the people involved recognized anecdotally that there were clear gendered patterns for both the sexual violence and its impact. Since we had conducted more evaluations from men at that point, approximately 65 to 35% ratio, we decided to first consider the experiences of Syrian men. And we received funding from the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and then what was DFID and now the FCDO. Following an informed consent process, in addition to using the initial data we'd collected in the forensic evaluations, we conducted follow-up semi-structured interviews with men who had disclosed conflict-related sexual violence in their forensic evaluations. Our aim was to have much deeper, broader conversations with these men about the impacts and their changes over time, and to extend that discussion into social, economic, and legal aspects to talk about self-identity, gender roles and expectations, and also to consider radiating impacts on families and communities. We had probably over-ambitious set of research questions, but these included risk factors for male conflict-related sexual violence in Syria, types and circumstances of male conflict-related sexual violence in Syrian detention, survivor-reported impacts and their variation over time, radiating impacts on families and communities, barriers to access, factors for positive resilience, and possible perpetrator motivation based on conduct and statements reported at the time of perpetration. The Lancet eClinical Medicine article that we'll be discussing today is the first publication from this research, and it focuses specifically on medical and psychological impacts and their change over time. We hope to publish our findings from additional research questions in the near future. For example, our colleagues on the research team at the University of Galway are completing 2 articles focused on Jill Stauber's ethical loneliness theory, and a deeper dive on ethical loneliness, which flows from international community inaction and neglect. Syria has been described as the epicenter for international neglect, but we of course acknowledge there are other places which would also qualify for that title, unfortunately. At this point, I would like to pause and acknowledge the compounding catastrophic effect of the February 2023 earthquake on Syrians. The earthquake occurred about a year after our final research interviews were completed. We lost one of our study participants in the earthquake and many incredible Syrian activists and first responders who had fought bravely and persistently for justice and the rights of Syrians since 2011. We are deeply grateful for our study participants who embarked on brave, often transformative conversations about often very taboo subjects. Speaking for Synergy and myself personally, we're deeply grateful for our partnership with LDHR, which has been so productive and so innovative for more than 10 years. We'd also like to take the opportunity to thank our donors, the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the FCDO, as well as the University of Galway, and in particular, Kathleen Kavanagh, for initiating and coming up with the idea to do this research and for supporting our work. I'm delighted that we have gathered today, the members of the research team, to share their experiences and insights from this important work. We'll start today with Dr. Mahmoud Aswad, who is the Executive Manager at LDHR. Dr. Aswad, over to you.
Thank you, Ingrid. شكرا جزيلا Ingrid. والشكر موصول.
Thank you, Ingrid. And I would like to extend my thanks to, as you mentioned, to the survivors, males and females. And in this case, the male survivors who were brave enough to share their documentation with the FMEs in the first time and in the interviews later for the research. And also, I would like to thank Synergy for this partnership that have gone over the years in the past period, both technically and administratively. I would like also to thank the brave male and female doctors, especially those who are working in the war circumstances. And here in the research, I would like to highlight that there was a very important role in this research for female doctors, and as well as the female doctors who documented cases. As you mentioned, LDHR is a network of doctors and who worked in partnership with Synergy for Justice. And we were able to reach this group of people that needs a high level of trust to get into the depths of those people or this group of people, especially when we're talking about sexual violence against men. This required a lot of bravery that starts with the initial communication with the case managers, and it doesn't end with the with the completion of the documentation. So we start in this relationship with the case managers, managing the relation with them, taking the clinical story, the medical history of them, and then the narrative of what happened to them. And after months and years, we conducted this research again. So we had to interview them again. So all of that requires a lot of effort by the doctors who documented the cases and other experts. All of this effort that was exerted led to a high level of trust by the survivors to vent out or to entrust the doctors with those stories, especially when we're talking about sexual violence. This requires a huge or a high level of bravery by the survivors and high experience by the doctors and NDHR who were trained to be able to gain this trust and to in order to get that disclosure from the survivors about these harsh stories. We needed for the research, we needed to accumulate expertise and to select the doctors who should do that work. So we selected the doctors who conducted the most or the largest number of documentations, the largest number of reviewed documentations, those who participated in so many activities and trainings. And we selected the 5 researchers to take part in this important research, through which we moved from the documentation process for human rights reports and accountability purposes to look into the socio-economic aspects, the legal aspects, the societal aspects that were not covered in the documentation, because the documentation focused on the detention period and the physical and psychological findings found with the survivors at the time of the interview. So those interviews that took place with the survivors, in the beginning, they had some abstention from talking about the critical or the hard issues that they faced during detention. However, we managed to get the trust of the survivors to share these stories with the doctors. And because of that, we managed through this research to show those aspects that the survivors experienced and were able to disclose, because the Syrian issue is very complicated, and we have several aspects and layers of complication to this issue. So we, as doctors who are dealing with those people, we need to show all aspects of suffering, agony, psychological and physical torture, and including pointing to the perpetrators, on top of which is the Syrian regime, and how they are destroying the souls and spirits of people. I don't want to talk about the experience of doctors who documented those cases. This is something that Dr. Nasser and Zaina and other experts are going to cover, and they're going to speak more into this, and they're going to talk about their experience in the interviews. However, I just want to highlight one important thing. Such academic research was a necessity, and it should be the starting point, not a one-time off research, because without such research and without the documentation that we are doing, and without the work that we are providing and the services that we are providing, as well as all the work that we do to raise awareness in order to overcome stigma and overcome other difficulties, all of that work that we're doing with our partners in Synergy, without all of it, we will not be able to achieve the desired change, and we will not be able, through all of these activities, to stop the torture, psychological and sexual torture and physical torture that is being perpetrated in Syria, because our ultimate goal is for the future of Syria and for the world to put an end to the impunity for sexual violence and sexual torture that is perpetrated by authorities, and have a better future for all. And here I will pass the microphone, so to speak, to my colleague Colleen to talk about the findings of this research. Thank you, Ingrid, and thank you all for this opportunity.
Thanks, Mahmoud. And if we could get the slides, folks, I know some of you have read the article, some have not. So I'm going to just hit the highlights, especially on results and, frankly, the really complex methodology that was used in this project. And as long as we're thanking folks, in addition to everybody there and on the phone thinking about this work daily, the editors of eClinical Medicine and Lancet were amazing. From the beginning, they were committed to publish this work on Syria. It required multiple changes in our manuscript, as many of you have experienced over time, but it made a huge difference in being able to publish in this kind of setting to get the attention on men. Many of you on the call, I can see, are researchers and committed to male research for long periods of time. So I'm excited to present what our findings were today. So on the second slide, we had no disclosures to make to anyone. On the third slide, my hope is that we go to the next slide, please. We will do a couple things together in our short period of time together today. One is understand better the longitudinal evolving symptoms from the lens of the torture survivors. Second is we'll understand the impact on the family and community cohesion on these experiences. And third is we'll figure out how to better address it. So public policy and community impact and displacement such a prominent feature in our world. On the next slide, we'll talk about the key literature, and I want to thank, again, the researchers and the public policy folks on the call today for your decades of work in this population. There is an increasing body of literature, respected evidence-based literature on men and sexual violence, but we're not anywhere close to the literature on women. So what we know is that acute and chronic psychological and physical health findings that are associated with sexual violence are typically reflected somewhat by survivors, but most importantly in the past literature through key informants who had interviewed those men or women or boys and or service organizations who had tried to support them at single points in time in their history. The prior research generally had smaller sample sizes in the range of 20 to 30 men. Some studies actually discussed the short and long-term mental and physical consequences of sexual violence, as well as those who recognized those radiating impacts of the economic, social, intimacy, and familial effects of this sort of torture. What we know from the prior literature are a couple really important things when we think about how men adapt to this level of trauma. They are highly, at least in the Bosnian work, highly avoidant regarding their sexual trauma, and they focus on what matters at the moment. So it's daily stressors, work, their displacement, their family impact, and they see their experience as torture and not sexual violence. So without the skills of asking these specific questions around sexual violence, we miss it and we underreport the level of sexual violence present. The big gap in the literature from our perspective as a research team is the voice of the men and the voice of the men over time. So their self-reported symptoms and conditions, which is what you will talk about today. The next slide, what we know around the ICC definition of CRSV that we used is a very comprehensive approach to what is conflict-related sexual violence, and it includes beyond rape, violence to the genitals, collective humiliation, those who were forced to witness sexual violence in others, forced nudity, threats of sexual violence against self and others, and verbal sexualized abuse, a very prominent impact. And you'll see that all of these are reflected in our data. On the next slide, our research aim, our goal, and I think you've already gotten it, is how does this evolve? Many of us who are clinicians and policymakers and researchers get these single windows of exposure to people who've been through dramatic trauma. And yet very few of us actually get to follow people over time. Some therapists who are on the phone would know exactly what we're talking about with how people evolve in their meaning and understanding of the sexual violence consequences. So our study was an observational cohort study. 106 men were involved from 2012 to 2022, and more than happy to discuss the methodology of the selection of those men. But leave it to say that all of them had a forensic medical evaluation, then followed by a semi-structured interview, and all had multiple forms of trauma during detention, including sexual, psychological, and physical torture, as well as sexual and reproductive health symptoms and conditions. On the next slide. So this is an important pivot point of understanding for all of us, and that is that we've said we've watched them over time. And what that meant for us is understanding their self-report at multiple points in time, the first one being, what do you recall about the detention period? The second time is the post-release period. The third time is that time of the forensic medical evaluation. And for LDHR and the Syrian context, these men had both physical and psychological evaluations. So the word medical is comprehensive in this point. And at time 4, they had their research interview, their semi-structured research interview, and at the median 8.8 years following that time 1 of detention. So again, on methodology, time 1 and time 2 data, as they always are based on retrospective recall of that detention period and the post-release period. So those questions were asked at time 3 and time 4 about time 1 and time 2, and concurrent symptoms and findings were captured during time 3 and time 4. So thus we got a picture from the men's perspective, recognizing that there's serious recall bias for any of us in looking back over time at what we felt during that period. But I think when you look at the data, and especially the heat map, you'll see the very intuitive expected nature of this evolution occur. On the next slide. So just a quick reminder about the forensic medical evaluations. LDHR did not go out and seek these. These were confidential referrals from, as you can imagine, emergency rooms, clinics, NGOs, and service partners during the conflict. This is all done during the active conflict in Syria. The FMEs were done by the Lawyers and Doctors for Human Rights, a Syrian NGO functioning in Turkey. The physicians were trained for years in the Istanbul Protocol, including IP 2022, and collectively, as Ingrid described, documented more than 500 cases since 2011. The wonderful part that really enabled this research to occur is that all of the FMEs were done by doctors who used a single standard format with required data fields. Those data were reviewed, and the data was extracted by 5 trained, experienced LDHR physicians who are also our colleagues on the paper in advance of conducting those interviews. So all the data is extracted from the forensic evaluations and ready for those interviews, in which they were done in Arabic, occurred over a 1 to 2 hour period, and used some guiding questions and research themes throughout the interviews. On the next page, we get a look at the findings. So let's imagine for a minute that we're prior to that first arrest. What we know in those men is that they were mostly married. They were young, childless. They were Muslim, Arab Sunni men with more than a high school education, and they were stably housed in sites all over Syria. Their median age was 28, with a range of 15 to 55. All of them were detained at least once as a criteria for the research, and they had variable lengths of time in detention. But here's where some of the most serious data developed as we looked at the demographics of these men. Almost 91% of them were detained in military intelligence, high security sites known to be some of the most tortuous places in the world, with 63% of them reported being in additional regime sites as well. The mean number of detentions was 1.4, but the range is significant at 1 to 11. The duration of detention, if any of us can imagine, was the mean duration was almost 19 months. Their median was 8 months, with a range of 2 days to almost 10 years. 40% of these men were detained for more than a year, and another 9.4% for 5 years. So 50% of our sample size were in detention sites for greater than a year. Next slide. So what did they tell us? What they told us is remarkable in its prevalence compared to other studies. And we described that in the eClinical Medicine article, with 97% of these men reporting forced nudity at multiple times during their detention, not just when they were initially brought into the facility or when they were interrogated, but at multiple times, including during forced positioning and suspension. 94% had verbal abuse as a regular part of their detention. Almost 80% were threatened specifically with sexual violence, and almost half described direct violence to the genitals or anus during this time. 43% witnessed sexual violence in others. 30% described collective humiliation. And as we described, 9% described rape. On the next slide, we'll get a sense for what I believe is some of the beauty. As a clinician for 30 years, we rarely get to see this kind of evolutionary data. So in detention, everything you would expect: pain, bleeding, wounds, infections, difficulty sleeping, shame about being there and being forced nakedness over periods of time. Anxiety is there, and despair about when they might ever be released. They are released in time 2, and here's what they can remember: still significant pain, difficulty sleeping, and we see the beginning of intrusive memories of that period of detention. We see nightmares, of course, scars developed from all of those open wounds. Sadness is very prominent, as is anxiety. The fear is intense and prolonged that they're describing during this time. They begin to avoid. So we're beginning to see avoidance of triggers and avoidance of people and avoidance of places in which those memories can occur. And finally, this sense of weakness that really touched our team, some of which is weakness as a man, some of which is experienced as bodily weakness. And then we see this period of time between detention and the time they present for their forensic medical evaluation, which, if you read the paper, you can see that median in time, but it's years for the most part. And so at that point, when they finally are ready to tell their story and they've been connected to a group of experienced clinicians, they're telling a very different story. So scars are present, as we might expect, years later. But intrusive memories are prominent. Avoidance is prominent, as we described. A massive, almost 80% of them with body pain, difficulty sleeping, anxiety, nightmares. And we're beginning to see this isolation, this self-isolation, going from avoidance of those triggers to avoidance of people, and the need to isolate from family and community and work, etc., and the rise of anger by the time of the forensic evaluation, documented by the clinicians you'll meet today. And finally, time 4, and we'll spend a lot more time thinking about this together, but is that sense of lack of trust. So 67% of men described don't trust anybody, not even family members. Isolation is very significant. A whopping 64% of men with chronic body pain, low self-esteem, and difficulty sleeping, as we've described. So on the next slide, we see the heat map. And in the heat map, what I just want you to notice, it's a busy slide. The x-axis is all of the highly prevalent symptoms and conditions the men reported. The y-axis is over time. And what we noted is that there's some things that start in detention and get better over time. Many of those still persist at time 4. Some things begin primarily in the second phase, in the post-release phase, and either worsen or stabilize over time. And there are a few exceptions to that: anger, self-isolation, and lack of trust that build over time and max at time 4. Next slide. So our findings are that in addition to everything you've seen already, these men were also hit, slapped, punched at an extraordinary number of percent, at 90%. 60% of them said they were hit with multiple things. 48% were burned or electrocuted frequently on the genitalia, and 80% of these Syrian men were suspended or forced positions. About a quarter of them said they also had erectile dysfunction and difficulties with intimacy and sexual relations. And the most concerning for us as a research team is that 71% said they lacked knowledge about support services. 60% were too ashamed or embarrassed to seek them. And in our entire project, over the entire duration of their interactions with us, only 3% said that they saw formal support services as a major source of strength compared to their family and their communities. Next slide. So in summary, the evolution is fear, pain, to lack of trust, anger, and isolation. And on the next and final slide, what this means for us. These men were displaced from their home at extraordinary rates and their countries. All of them experienced multiple forms of trauma in multiple detention sites for prolonged periods of time. We know from the world literature that angry, distrustful, isolated men get sick. And they get sick from substance use, heart disease, dementia, stroke, depression, anxiety, and they die prematurely. And for each man who suffered that, they have families and children and communities. And so our call to action for all of you is to expand this work to promote early identification, to get a lot better at evidence-based interventions for men that reduce the devastating sequelae that happen very early on in this evolution. I'll close now and move our conversation to Dr. Mohammed Al-Sharif to hear from our colleagues in Syria. Thank you, Mohammed.
نعم. شكرا كولين، شكرا دكتور محمود وإنجريد.
Thank you, Colleen, Mahmoud, and Ingrid. The research has been a unique collaborative experience for both LDHR and Synergy experts. We learned a lot about our country, our people, and even ourselves in the course of this research. We have Dr. Zaina with us, who is a co-author of this study and is an expert documenter living in Syria, and who has documented around 50 cases of men and women who have reported being exposed to torture and sexual violence. My question to you, Dr. Zaina, is that can you please share your experience in in-depth interviews in the course of this, which you conducted in the course of this research, particularly that this research focuses on male survivors and your role in this research. And please describe the unique skills and lessons learned that you got from this experience. Hello, good evening, everyone. I would like to thank my colleagues who have participated earlier, Dr. Muhammad, Dr. Mahmoud, Colin, and Ingrid. And I'm honored to share part of my experience that I gained in the course of this research. As a female doctor who cooperated in and participated in this research, I interviewed a significant part of the cases in this research. This constituted a significant challenge, particularly that we were interviewing men from an Arab community in the Arab world, and in Syria in particular. It is quite embarrassing and significantly embarrassing to discuss things to do with sexual issues, let alone discussing horrific forms of sexual violence, things that we did not expect to come across when we started these interviews. This was the first challenge, but surely not the last. So I tried by various means, and with the support of my colleagues and our friends in Synergy, to overcome this challenge. So in the preparatory stage, we discussed this challenge, and we decided that we have been trained for years on interviewing survivors of sexual violence. And during those trainings for years, we have gained confidence in how to deal with those survivors of such forms of sexual violence. The other issue that helped me quite well to overcome this challenge or obstacle was that a significant part of the interviews that I conducted were already interviews or of survivors I have already interviewed for the regular documentation. So our experience in forensic medical evaluation already has built the trust and bridges of communication with survivors, allowing us and the survivors to open up and share their stories, their problems, and the things they were exposed to. And we explained beforehand that when we communicated with them again, that we were going to discuss specifically the sexual violence, and it was helpful for both of us to prepare to talk about this difficult form of torture which they were exposed to, particularly when they have experienced it firsthand. After those interviews, the big shock for me was in the 50 documentation I have conducted personally, I felt certain that those people or survivors have been exposed to severe torture, violence, trauma, etc. Yet I did not expect such horrific forms of sexual violence. And also what was quite shocking was to recognize and observe the unbelievable impact that remained with the survivors of sexual violence. At the beginning, I thought they would have some impact which they would suffer during detention or immediately or in the short term after their release. However, a large number of survivors told us that for years they suffered the physical and psychological sequelae of sexual violence. And what is more is that this impact was not only on the survivor themselves, but also their wives, children, immediate family, and more extended family, hence the community at large. It wasn't only the physical and psychological impact, but there was also financial, economic, and even impact on the education of children. All of them, the root cause of which was the sexual violence to which the survivor was exposed. The final thing I would like to share is that this research has made a very positive impact on my experience and the interviews that for documentation that I conducted after this research. So because it helped me acquire even further knowledge and experience on how to interview survivors, and also I started to expect the story and to know that they have those stories, and I have to dig in the interview directly or indirectly to help them open up and offer the survivor the utmost help and support possible that they need direly. I would like to thank you for giving me the chance to explain my experience in this research. Thank you, Dr. Zaina, for those very interesting ideas. Now I would like to give the floor to Dr. Nasser, who's a psychiatrist and an expert researcher who documented many cases of torture and sexual violence. Dr. Nasser, as a psychiatrist and a specialized psychiatrist and a documenter, how would you describe your experience in this research, and how would this research affect the forensic medicine evaluation interviews which LDHR doctors are conducting? And also, if you have any recommendations for people working in the same field you would like to share. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Muhammad, and I would like also to thank all of our colleagues in both LDHR and Synergy and all of the speakers. As a psychiatrist, I have decades of experience in conducting interviews with psychological patients and following up on their cases. However, I believe that this research has offered us all in both Synergy and LDHR Have we lost the speaker?
Omar, we can't hear you.
I think we lost the speaker. Yeah, Dr. Nasser, we couldn't hear you for a moment. Now you're back. What I wanted to say is that we started to realize that survivors of detention, at the end of the day, have their lives to go back to, their families, their careers, and they went through these horrific experiences and sexual violations, which have significant, huge impact on male survivors and leave behind, especially a psychological impact, since this is my specialization. And it was striking that it leaves long-term psychological impact, although we have interviewed those people years, but for the most part after their release, they still manifested those impacts. We lost him again.
دكتور ناصر
Can you hear me? Yes, we can.
كنت عم بقول إنه
So I was saying that our methodology and our attitude as documenters and LDHR changed in this research. We thought that it was the detainees and the survivors who have suffered the impact only psychologically, physically, and otherwise. However, in our research interviews, we started to realize that there are so many other dimensions and so many other things that are changing due to their detention experience, the circumstances, their personal circumstances, as well as their familial circumstances. It was eye-opening to see the survivor as an individual, a member of a family, a member of an extended community as well. And one example I would like to share, one survivor told us that that the impact on their children was huge, and they could not access education because of the displacement and the ongoing conflict, and also that their children were threatened directly with being detained and arrested themselves, and some of their children, since their fathers or their surviving loved ones were with them, they noticed the long-term impact, the inability to work, inability to provide for the family, etc. And also, this is further complicated with the displacement or being refugeed and the experiences of bullying and discrimination to which children are being exposed. So we realized that it was imperative to inquire even further about those impacts on the long term and on legal and social levels, as well as the psychological and physical. Because one of the survivors, for example, mentioned he was living in Turkey after detention. He was living with his friends and he was unemployed, and he needed an operation in his eye because of an injury he received in detention, but he was unable to undergo that surgery because of his financial situation. Another issue was that most detainees and survivors who survived sexual violence suffered the psychological impacts during detention, including suicidal ideation and death wishes, and many of them suffered what we call post-traumatic stress disorder, and we expected as doctors or documenters that those symptoms would last for months after the release. However, in our research interviews, we noticed that they suffered depression and prolonged PTSD, and that they manifested long-term psychological symptoms. Also, in LDHR, we started to recognize more common denominators, if you like, between in the survivor community, so to speak. And we have started to better recognize their urgent needs and recognize the massive lack and gap in addressing those needs, whether in Syria or in neighboring countries. And also, after studying this data set and taking the research interviews, we noticed that there are those common denominators, while also recognizing that the degree of the impact differs from one person to the other and also from one community to the other. But ultimately, the impact on the community and the family was significant, and consequently, we have even modified our documentation form in order to address in further depth those impacts on the children, the family, and the community at large. I would like to conclude by calling urgently for further funding being funneled to service provision for support of those survivors, identification of survivors, and also of documentation itself, in addition to supporting protective services for those survivors. Thank you, Dr. Nasser, for those important points. Now my question goes to Dr. Colleen, the international expert on documentation and the main author of this study. Dr. Colleen, since you have worked in the Syrian context for a long period of time and trained many Syrian doctors on documentation in accordance with the Istanbul Protocol, would you please tell us how strong you would say this research has been, that has been conducted by both local and international experts from LDHR and Synergy, and how this experience can be used and reflected in other conflict settings around the world?
Thanks, Mohammed. I think, again, let's go back to our goal. Our goal is to hear the voice of the men. And so we made a choice early on not to use international experts to do these interviews or provide focus groups of small groups of men to get feedback from NGOs, for example. We wanted to hear their perspective directly. And our hypothesis was that in that setting, co-designing the research, co-designing the aims, co-designing the structured interviews, and having our LDHR physician partners who have the deepest experience in documentation of forensic medical findings do these interviews themselves. This decision to collaborate from the beginning crossed all steps of the research. All the interviews, as I said, were in Arabic. We had mentoring ongoing for challenging interviews, and we had feedback on the efficacy of our semi-structured questions in real time. So the result was a much deeper understanding of those survivors and the immediate opportunities for change for LDHR, including we changed standard questions in our FME, and we changed training strategies in our Istanbul Protocol training that led to much deeper and broader understanding of the experiences. Thanks, Mohammed.
نعم. شكرا كولين. حقيقة يعني
Thank you, Colleen. as a local participant in this research, I would like to say that we benefited a lot from your experience, and I believe that this research can be used for other conflict settings and internationally. My question now is for our legal expert, Ingrid. It's clear now that from this research has implications for programs and policies. Would you please tell us a bit more about this, the implications for policies?
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed. I'll just take a short amount of time just to mention 4 policy implications that I recognise from this research. I believe that the audience will have many additional thoughts and ideas about policy and programming implications from these findings. And I hope that the audience will share those in the Q&A function or the chat function if it's available. So I think starting with one of the most important implications is prevention. You know, what we've learned from the work we've done together and from this research is that conflict-related sexual violence in Syrian detentions is pervasive. And after a median of 8.8 years later, there is a profound and continuing impact of violence on these men and on their communities. By time 4, we have 2/3 or more survivors still reporting scars, avoidance, intrusive memories, lack of trust, isolation, chronic pain, and more than half still reporting long-term anger and low self-esteem. These are profound impacts that deeply affect day-to-day lives of these men and the relationships they have around them. I cannot think of a better reason and a greater call to double our efforts on prevention and to urge all steps possible to end the continuing violence against detainees in Syria. I think there's a lot more to be said on prevention, but given the time, I'll move on to my second policy implication. I think it's important for us to recognise the symptoms that grow over time. I'm going to say there are 4 symptoms that grow over time, although the article focuses on anger, lack of trust and self-isolation. But low self-esteem also rises at time 2 and maintains through to time 4. As Colleen said in the findings, generations of angry, distrustful, isolated men present risks to their own health, but they also present risks to their family and to their community. We recognise these symptoms as drivers of violence within families and communities, with a clear effect on conflict and the chances of post-conflict peace building, reparation, societal bonds, and economic recoveries. When you consider the combination with poverty, economic, ethical loneliness, or perceptions of injustice or neglect, these symptoms of anger, lack of trust, isolation, and low self-esteem are recognised markers or risk factors for radicalisation and extremism, and therefore drivers of violence. The third implication, I would say, is the radiating impacts, and we've heard this from many of the research team, just the importance of that. For each man who experiences torture or sexual violence in detention, they have partners, children, families, and communities who also suffer. I think our humanitarian response system is very much geared towards individual direct survivors, and we do not account for collective harm. I think our services and programming must get better at that. We must provide access, individual access for men, and understand that, but we must also consider the families and communities that are also damaged by this. And lastly, and this has been touched upon, is access to services for men. As Colleen pointed out in the findings section, only 3% of these men accessed or found strength in formal services. And that's after eight years, a median of 8 years or almost 9 years. It's critical that male survivors can have meaningful access to medical, psychological, sexual reproductive health, social, and critically livelihood support initiatives. These services must be tailored to men, including at the access point and in terms of competency and methodology of service provision. These services must actively seek to reduce gendered barriers to access including enhancing, not diminishing men's sense of dignity and encouraging help-seeking behaviours. Community work and strategic communication is needed to tackle gender narratives around male help-seeking and sexual violence, and to help reduce internalised social and structural stigma and shame. So I'm going to stop there. I hope the audience will also share their thoughts on the implications of this research, and I'll hand it back to Dr. Mohammed.
شكرا إنجريد.
Thank you, Ingrid. I would like to thank everyone for all of those ideas and the challenges you have just discussed. I have to tell everyone that you can access the full text of this study using the links that Natalie and Mira shared on the chat box. I believe, according to my watch, we have 30 minutes, which we are going to open for discussions, questions, and answers if you have any. So you can write your questions in the chat box or in the Q&A section, or ask Mira and Natalie to give you the microphone to pose your question immediately or directly. Even if you want to discuss or communicate with a specific speaker, you can also write that in the chat box for Mira and Natalie. Mira, we're going to take some people who are going to participate using the microphone, and then we're going to read out some of the questions.
Dr. Mohammed, في سؤال بالQ&A لو ممكن دكتور ناصر يجاوب عليه.
طيب تمام دكتور ناصر. في سؤال عن من كمال، انه اذا كان في اي تحدي، يعني كان في اي تحديات خلال المقابلات اللي بنسويها بالDHR.
So the question from Kamal was, were there any challenges during the interviews, and how you dealt with those?
أنا كتبت تشات كنت عم حاول أكتب هلا من شوي. هلا نحن في عندنا بروتوكول بالمنظمة خلال التوثيق إذا صار.
Thank you very much. So I wrote on the chat, and now I'm going to answer again. We have a protocol in LDHR. So when we have a documenter, the documenter is not alone. He will have an assistant if he needed any assistance. So during the documentation or during the semi-structured interviews that we conducted for the research, we have a de-escalation protocol, so we can calm the patient down, we can discuss the issues that made them get angry also. But if we saw or we found that we needed something more, we can take a break. We can give him a break to have some tea, coffee, or anything. And we also have an agreed upon protocol that if we see that we lost control over the interview, that we will end the interview, postpone it to a different time, or to refer the patient to any psychological service if he needs such services. Thank you very much. I hope that the answer this answers your question, Mr. Kamal. We're going to move to another question. If anybody wants to speak over their microphones, please say so in the chat, and we're going to allow you to open your microphone. Let's take another question, Mira. The second question is, what is the experience of the clients and their feelings in general after sharing their experiences? I will answer this question. Some survivors or some clients showed or expressed their relief. And they expressed that saying that it was like a rock on their chest, and that they are relieved from that, that they have been for years living under that pressure, and they didn't have any opportunity to speak about that experience to anyone. Once they had this confidential, safe environment and the rapport that was built with them between the survivor and the documenter. So this allowed them to speak openly about these deep emotions and deep sensitive issues that they had. Some of the feedback that we received from the case managers, from the survivors, that they shared. This is some of the feedback that we received from survivors after sharing their experience. They sent to the case managers, especially that they did so with somebody that they trust in a safe and confidential environment, facing a professional who was dealing with it or who was dealing with this information in a professional way. I hope that this answered your question as well. Mira, do we have another question? We have another question from Asala Murad, and she requested to take the microphone to speak. Go ahead, Asala. Hello. First of all, well done, and thank you for this research, especially that is about the males, because for some time, most of the work is about females and the impact of psychological or physical torture on females. I believe that this is a rare research on males. My question is there any differences between the psychological or physical signs or findings on between males and females? And the second question is, some of those that you conducted the research with, did they show willingness to take psychosocial support sessions, for example, and those who have, for example, marks of torture on their bodies. So were they accepting of that in order to be integrated in the community? In addition to that, did you have any success stories of people who suffered from such injury from or such torture? My question is, did you have evidence that for those success stories that can be a role models for others, especially for us working in civil society organizations, that we can follow in order to support others who went through similar experiences in order to get over that problem? Thank you very much for your questions, Ms. Al-Sala. I will give the microphone to Dr. Zainab to answer the first part of your question, especially that she, as a documenter, a female documenter, she documented so many of the female cases, and she participated in this research. So, Dr. Zainab, what are the similarities that you have noticed in terms of the type of sexual violence that males and females were subjected to? Thank you, Asala, for this question. Let me, I will answer this question in 2 points. First, what was the purpose of sexual violence that they were subjected to? And the second point is, what are the similarities? So first, the objective was humiliation. It was the sexual violence against men or women was for humiliation. So it was the humiliation for men, or if it was a woman that was subjected to sexual violence, the goal was not only humiliating herself, but also to humiliate all the males relatives, her father or her brother or anybody. So that was part of the purpose or objective of the sexual violence that was perpetrated. And there is another purpose, which is subjugating the female that is subjected to sexual violence, or their male relatives. In terms of the similarities for females and males who were subjected to sexual violence, let's talk about verbal humiliation of sexual nature. Males and females were subject to partial or complete forced nudity. Both men and women were subjected to. In terms of rape, rape was more amongst women, but even for females, they were raped in the anus, not only in their vaginas, but also in terms of the electrocution. Males were electrocuted more on their genitals. Colleen, as an expert, would you please answer to the same question, please?
So,
your
Asala,
experience.
4 great questions, obviously. The first one was on males and females, and I'll just address that briefly in the literature. I'm sure you know it as well as I do. What I saw as someone who's been in multiple conflict settings is that for men, the co-occurrence of sexual violence and physical violence is extremely high. For women, they frequently will describe the sexual violence that occurred without the outrageous amounts of head trauma, burning, electrocution, forced position. Certainly it happens, but the co-occurrence, the comorbidity of numbers and types of trauma for men is quite significant. And I think it's easy for the sexual violence to then drop to the bottom of their awareness, and for them to be more focused on, as you described in question 3, around the scar impact, etc. I'll just state what I heard, Sala. Your other questions were, the second was on, did men in the setting of these semi-structured interviews take the referrals that were recommended? The third is, what happened with these highly visible scars over time, or these highly impactful scars to people who only had their intimate people know about the scars that were present? And the third thing I heard is, do you have anything to say, LDHR and Synergy, around evidence that you've seen for an ability for people to get better? In other words, what are the resilience factors, and what do you believe happened in these research interviews that actually turned the tide for people to be able to put words to this trauma? So I'll turn it back to you, Mohammed, but I just wanted to state those other questions because they're so powerful. Do we want to address those other questions, Mohammed? So, for example, if you could address the second one on referrals.
تمام كولين، إذا فيك أنت تجاوب عليه أكيد بنحب نسمع خبرتك.
For sure, Colleen, if you can or you would like to answer them, I would love to hear you answer these questions.
I'll just describe what I know, but I think it's really important for our Syrian colleagues to describe cases they've seen as well. As you guys know, well, let me just say what you might not know. LDHR, their primary work besides forensic evaluations has been in public education and stigma, as well as clinician education about what trauma and torture look like. But in addition, there's another arm of their work, and that has been this case management and partnership with NGOs and treatment settings in which people are regularly referred. So that same process was set up in the year we spent looking at the ethical implications of this work. That same process of having case managers at the ready and emergently ready to move people into referrals was present for every interview. And so people were referred. What I can't say, and Mahmoud and Mohammed, you might jump in as well, is that, as you guys know, this is an active conflict. And so tracking people, whether it's to Germany or Jordan or Turkey or within Syria, tracking people over time to see if those referrals were kept and what the outcomes of those were, was not part of the project. And so it's a serious gap in the literature. to describe what happens to folks after that. Mohammed and Mahmoud, if you guys want to jump in on that, specifically around LDHR's work to make sure that people got connected, especially as Nasser described, the very urgent psychological impact that was seen in some cases, which really required immediate referrals.
نعم. شكرا كولين على هذا
Thank you, Colleen, for this clarification. Dr. Mahmoud, would you like to add anything?
شكرا كولين شكرا محمد.
Thank you.
بس توضيح بسيط وسريع.
A quick clarification. This is the purpose of an integrated work. When we have an institution that works in documentation or human rights, so we need to have the linkages amongst the different departments and to have a department that is ready to intervene at any point. First of all, the doctors are already qualified to deal with these cases, and they are trained by experts to deal with this issue. So we have this harmony between the doctors and the referral department to deal with each case in question. We need to remember that the case management, since the beginning, makes an assessment for each separate case, and the referral department or the case management department discusses the case with the doctor who is going to document it before, during, and after the documentation, because it is an ongoing process. So this link between the referral department and the documentation is not a flow that takes a step one, step two, step three. It is there is an overlap that goes hand in hand between the doctor, the referral system, and other partners, because we have other partners who provide services that we cannot provide because of the nature of our work. So I just wanted to comment on the internal integration and the external integration with other partners who provide services that we cannot provide at LDHR for the benefit of the survivor. Thank you. Thank you, Mahmoud. Just before we move to the question of Yazan, I want to inform you that one of the some of the findings of the research, when we were doing the interview with the survivors, some of the needs appeared during the interview. So we refer them to the partners who are able to address these needs, which is out of the scope of the research. So I hope that your questions were answered, Asala. Now we're going to listen to Yazan. Go ahead, Yazan. Mira, would you please open his microphone? Thank you. First of all, thank you for your efforts and for paying attention to this issue. As a survivor myself, I am very interested to see studies about this issue in order to know my situation and how can I face what I'm struggling with. So first of all, I would like to I would like to talk about what happened to me each time people were subjected to sexual violence. And here I'm commenting on Dr. Zaina and what she said. Sometimes the sexual violence was for pressure, for extracting information, and sometimes it was just a reaction to something that happened with the officers outside. Maybe they were, for example, coming from a place and they were in a conflict, and some of their affiliate members were killed, so they come and take revenge from the detainees. Or if one of us was late in toilets and we got late in toilets over the time that we were allowed to spend in toilets, so they will do that. Or if they discovered that we were fasting, for example, they wanted to humiliate us for that. So this is the first time in this research that I see the different types of sexual violence. Before listening to you here, I thought that sexual violence is only rape, but I saw the different parts. But for example, you didn't mention the use of the Kalashnikov. Usually, they used the tube in the anus, and when they do it, Of course, it's going to have an injury in the anus, and once this injury happened, people will not eat. And this is what happened to me, actually. However, in the interrogation, I didn't say anything. So, the question that I have, if because I'm expecting a son or a boy, and maybe I'm going to raise him to take revenge for what I have gone through after he is over 18. I think this is not a healthy thinking, but maybe in our societies it is a problem if we don't take revenge against those who paid us injustice. But I believe this is unjust to my son, as unjust to the next generation. So how can we deal with this issue? And as Asala said, if there are any achievements that were achieved, for me myself, keeping my marital relationship is one of the successes. All of my inmates or inmates that I know who were subjected to sexual violence, they were divorced. They broke up. But this is an achievement by itself in what I'm doing. So this is one of the achievements, I believe, and there are other stories that can do that. And thank you very much. Yes, and thank you. I would like to thank you yourself for sharing this experience. Brave people like you are already participating for and taking part for us to hear such stories. And as Ingrid mentioned a while ago, which is prevention, instead of waiting for the problem to happen and then address it. So we need to have tools or means for prevention beforehand. I completely understand what you said, and all the feelings of people who were treated badly, which is the feeling of or the desire to take revenge. This is something that we have seen through our experience in LDHR. However, one of the things that we found in our research is a rule, and I hope everyone to hear, which is violence can only generate violence. So we cannot solve the problem by a counter violence. So through such research, we can look for the prevention to means in order to stop anyone from being subjected to violence, and to refer the criminals and perpetrators to genuine tribunals and courts in order to be held accountable for the crimes that they have perpetrated. Ingrid, I don't know if you can add anything from a legal perspective. So Yazan's question in specific is that in the lack or in the absence of justice, so the only thing available for survivors is the desire to take revenge or the desire to vengeance from the perpetrators. So what is your input in this field, Ingrid?
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed, and thank you, Yazan, for your contribution. It makes my heart feel lighter to know that actually this work it resonates and is appreciated and can directly assist survivors themselves. So to talk a little bit, Dr. Mohammed, I agree, violence often begets violence. And one of the critical things I think for Syrians is to find ways to stop the cycle of violence and to find ways to actually disrupt conflict and disrupt those kind of destructive influences that, of course, first affect families and then communities and then society. Obviously, I mentioned earlier the work that's being done by our Galway colleagues that specifically talks about something called what's known as ethical loneliness, but essentially it's where people feel like they've not been heard, where they've not managed to achieve justice, or that they've been silenced in some way, or their pain has been neglected or unacknowledged, and what that can then cause, and the impact, the further secondary impacts that then causes. And I think that's really where we see LDHR's work in justice and accountability. I think it starts with listening. It starts with actually creating the space for survivors to talk about what happened and for them to be heard and to do something and to help survivors do something with what they have to share. So, for example, even on the access to service point, the next step that LDHR hopes to do is to co-design with male survivors how to improve access to services in Syria, to make sure that the service provision, the design of access, the design of services works for male survivors in Syria, find ways to actually help survivors make the changes that they need. And picking up on the justice point, and there's been a couple of questions about this, so I think it's important to acknowledge that this research, while it's not specifically about accountability, will contribute to accountability. So the research in itself, I know, has been picked up by investigators, prosecutors, IIIM, and various others who are looking for accountability in both criminal settings and state-to-state settings like the International Court of Justice. And so this kind of data, this kind of research and rigor about the impacts of sexual violence and the typology and prevalence of sexual violence in this cohort can actually be incredibly helpful and contribute to justice as well. So it's through this work, through the bravery of survivors, through sharing their stories, through helping co-design research and programming and policy implications that follow, I think can give survivors a way to try to make changes and be agents of change that may help redirect the desire for revenge, I hope. I also think we need to all work together and make sure that survivors' voices are at the forefront of designing services and access to services, because I think in that space where we can find resilience, where we can change the course of the future, that's where I think we can change the course of the futures for individuals, for their families, and for their communities. Dr. Mohammed.
شكرا إنجريد. بدي يعني
Thank you, Ingrid, for your answer. We have less than 5 minutes, so we're going to continue answering all the questions in the chat. The next question is to Dr. Mahmoud. One of the questions says that if we support in the courts that are taking place based on the universal jurisdiction in Europe, such as the case against Ala al-Khatib, have you participated in that, or did you have anything in that field? Thank you very much. So the main purpose of documentation is taking part or contributing to the tracks or the paths of justice. And we do that through our partners. We don't prosecute we don't file cases ourselves, but through the partners who are doing that, such as the IIIM, the Kernigat 27 or 37 or others. So we provide them with the documentation that we have through the informed consent that we have, and to make use of the documentation, and they do their part of building cases and the filing the cases. So we participated in 9 cases that are taking place in Europe without defining the places or which ones, because in order to keep the confidentiality, because at the point where they are collecting or building the case and collecting testimonies. So the main purpose is to communicate these testimonies to the court that are addressing this issue or working for accountability, and maybe in the future also for any national court or other courts. Thank you very much, Mahmoud. There is also a question about the stigma raising awareness program, and if there are any examples how communities are reacting to that, and if you have any changes within or among survivors of sexual violence through these programs. I'm going to answer quickly, and Dr. Zaina, if you can also add to this question, because myself and Dr. Zaina are one of the trainers in this program that LDHR has been conducting for over 5 years in the north of Syria and the south of Turkey. This program is one of the programs that had great impact on the ground, whether the communities that were covered with this program or in each respective community. The good thing of this program is that we conduct an assessment of a certain community through questions that are made by enumerators that we train. So they ask these questions to the community in order to measure or gauge the stigma within the community. And then we conduct raising awareness for months, and then we ask the same questions to the same community, and we measure the difference in their answers through the awareness raising that we have conducted in that community. We were able to see a significant change in those communities that we have conducted these awareness raising campaigns or trainings. Dr. Zaina, would you like to add anything to this answer on this program? Quickly, I will share my experience in this field. Stigma was one of the most important obstacles for male and female survivors to speak about the sexual violence they were subjected to in detention. Now, after so many years of the conflict, and because the detainees were subjected to several types of torture by different actors. So those who participated in our program, we managed to see significant change in terms of stigma and how the community is dealing with this issue. In the beginning of the conflict, especially for female detainees and then for male detainees, nobody of them would speak that they have been subjected to sexual violence. One of the main obstacles is their fear of stigma and the reaction of their families, their communities to this issue. So because of the stigma, survivors might be killed. After years of work, and we started to see that male survivors are talking that they were, for example, completely stripped naked, or they were, for example, electrocuted on their genitals. Before that, we didn't hear that. In terms of the women survivors, they started to talk about significant sexual violence typology. And again, I would say that before 2017, we didn't hear that, but now we can hear some people talking about such experiences. Thank you very much, Dr. Zaina. Ingrid, you want to add something? Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I would really appreciate the question about the stigma programming. We have 5 years of data about what works in tackling stigma in Syrian communities. And actually, it's one of the areas that we would like to do follow-up research on. So we'd like to we have baseline surveys and follow-up surveys based on mobile teams and part-time community action plans. There's a lot that we've learned doing that work over 5 years. So we'd love to be able to do a research project just focused on that. And just to touch briefly on some other things to look forward to, I know people are beginning to leave as we hit time, but just so you know what's coming in terms of this research, I mentioned the 2 papers from our Galway colleagues on ethical loneliness. We're also planning on working on and publishing policy and briefing papers specifically on barriers to accessing services for male survivors, a policy piece on briefing papers on radiating impacts, one specifically on perpetrator motivation. I can, as the criminal lawyer, I'm particularly interested in that part, but also looking at things like articles based on Elizabeth Wood's foundational work, looking at conflict-related sexual violence as a policy or a tolerated practice in the Syrian regime. And we have a few other criminal justice papers coming on typology and a deep dive on things like forced nudity against men. as a crime, as an international crime. We'd also like to arrange for grants in the following additional research work. First of all, as a priority, we would like to repeat this for the women that we have done FMEs for, and to get the same kind of understanding of the evolution, the constellation and evolution of impacts for women. We'd also like to do further work specifically on male conflict-related sexual violence in Syria, one, to track them into the future and to look at resilience over time and circumstances, including the impact of the earthquake and continuing conflict and revived conflict and displacement, and specifically try to expand this work to look at male Syrian survivors who are now living in Europe and what that immigration has actually done, the ability to move to a different setting that is more secure. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, we'd also like to try to start to do work with this specific group of male survivors to help co-design better access to services and better service provision for these men. So I just wanted to flag up some of the things where we're going to try and go next for those who are on the call and still interested. Also, if there's any funders out there who have research grants they're looking for that might touch on some of those subjects, we would love to hear from you.
Mohammed, a quick closing remark?
أكيد كورين تفضلي.
Go ahead, Colleen.
I would just say to everybody who's hung in for the duration, our deep thanks. And your questions stimulated us and touched us deeply as a research team. So thanks for joining us. And we look forward to any outreach from you all on further discussions you'd like to have, presentations you'd like us to make in your arenas, and certainly to collaborate. Thanks so much for everybody today, and our greetings to all of our colleagues.
شكرا كورين. كمان أنا بدي أتشكركم جميعا.
Thank you, Colleen. I would like also to thank you all for staying with us. If you have any further questions or inquiries, please don't hesitate to communicate with us, and we will be willing to communicate with you. Dr. Nasser, do you want to add anything? Once again, I would like also to thank all the attendees, our colleagues. Thank you for your questions, for your interest in listening to this research, and thank you for this opportunity for this research. And I hope that we will have future opportunities for other research that will serve this cause and to learn from in the future. Mahmoud, Ingrid, would you like to add anything at the end of this webinar?
Just again, delighted that you could all join us today. I noticed a few people that joined us that were actually really key ingredients to all of this research. So a big shout out to the interpreters who also joined us, fellow researchers that are on the call, and particularly as well to the case managers who've been listening in. You are all vital members of the research team, and we are very appreciative for all that you've done to support this work.
شكرا إنجريد. حقيقة إضافة سريعة إنه هذا النتاج عمل.
Thank you, Ingrid. Once again, just one quick addition. This is an accumulative work for international and local expertise who believed in this work and the importance of raising the voices of survivors and communicating them or these voices to the world in order to end this practice and to serve justice and the non-repetition in the future. Thank you very much. I would like to thank all the international experts, Synergy for Justice, our brave doctors, men and women who were with us throughout the past period, those who were before us, those who are still with us, and those who are going to join us in the future. And I would like to thank the research team who made this research, as well as our colleagues or our partners in the Galloway University, and for all those who supported this research with Dr. Ingrid and Dr. Colleen. Thank you all. Thank you very much, and hope to see you in future opportunities. Thank you.